Risk and Resilience in the City. Findings from the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project. A presentation by Arete and CCARPH, Ateneo de Manila University. Narrated by Ricardo Abad. Illustrated and animated by Kevin De Guia.
Geographically located in the so-called Ring of Fire, the Philippines is prone to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Geographically situated in the typhoon belt, the Philippines is also most susceptible to typhoons, hurricanes, tsunamis, storm surges, floods, and droughts. These hazards result in heavy losses to human life and devastations to crops and properties. These losses worsen with climate change. As global warming continues to melt the ice caps in the North and South Poles, sea levels will warm, rise, and cause more powerful storms like Super Typhoon Yolanda. The rising sea temperatures and the growing pollution of the oceans will also destroy marine life and diminish our food supply. Not surprisingly, according to the Institute for Economics and Peace, the Philippines is the top country in the world with the highest overall hazard score. Exposure to these hazards will have zero disaster risk if they fall on unpopulated areas. But when super typhoons and earthquakes descend on places with dense human settlements, disaster risk will be much higher, unless, of course, the settlement can recover from floods and earthquakes. How is this possible? Disaster risk takes into account 4 factors: hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. In terms of a formula, disaster risk is equal to hazard multiplied by exposure multiplied by vulnerability and is divided by capacity. What is hazard? Hazard is a phenomenon that may cause loss of life, injury, ill health, and damage to property and the environment. Think of floods, typhoons, tsunamis, earthquakes, landslides, and the like. What is exposure? Exposure is the extent to which hazards will affect people, settlements, infrastructure, and other tangible assets. If an area has a large population or many dwelling units, then exposure is high. What is vulnerability? Vulnerability is the likelihood of loss owing to physical, social, economic, and environmental factors. If people inhabiting human settlements cannot protect themselves and their community from these hazards, their vulnerability is high. What is capacity? Capacity is the ability to avoid the losses that hazards bring. Thus, following the formula, disaster risk is high, 1, when communities are in areas prone to hazards like floods, typhoons, earthquakes, and landslides. 2, when these communities contain many people, settlements, and other assets exposed to these hazards. 3, when many people, homes, and properties are vulnerable. And 4, when people and communities do not have adequate knowledge and resources to prevent damage and loss. We may not stop the natural hazards from coming, but we can reduce exposure and vulnerability and increase our capacity for recovery. The Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines, or CCARPH, is a consortium of scientists, government leaders, community leaders, and representatives of non-governmental organizations or NGOs. The group came together in 2017 to study disaster risk and find ways to lessen the damage it brings. What did the project find? One set of findings pertains to global warming. In 3 Philippine cities, researchers found that the expansion of cities brought about a 20% increase in rainfall. This increase is the result of global warming. And if global warming continues, we can expect substantial increase in rainfall and flood levels in the coming years. If we do nothing or do too little, much of the land around the capital city of Manila could be underwater by 2100. Researchers also measured air pollution levels in a busy avenue in Quezon City. They found that the highest levels of air pollution take place during the rush hours in the morning when many people are going to school or work, and in the afternoons when many people are leaving from school or work. In addition, jeepney drivers who ply back and forth on the same avenue all day absorb air pollution particulates at a rate 4 times higher than the average guideline value set by the United Nations. On another front, CCARPH also wanted to know about vulnerability. The researchers asked, what kinds of communities, people, and social conditions were more likely to be vulnerable in the face of typhoons and floods? Studies took place in Metro Manila, Naga, and Iloilo. Vulnerability in the city, the study found, depends on where people live, how people live, and with whom people live. Where you live is where people reside. People who live in places near bodies of water, coasts, rivers, deltas, places where sea levels are low, are most likely to be vulnerable to floods, tsunamis, and typhoons, and at higher risk of being affected by these natural hazards. How you live refers to housing materials and housing conditions. People who live in homes made of light construction materials, or in dwellings that are dilapidated, or in units framed with makeshift roofs and walls are more likely to be the most vulnerable to hazards. Most vulnerable to are those who live in areas with inadequate waste management systems and those who share tubed or piped water or dug wells for cooking or drinking. With whom you live points to the kinds of people who are most vulnerable to disaster risk. These women and men are the unemployed, the lowly educated, the elderly, and the disabled. These are the people who rent their homes with or without consent. These are the persons working in the informal sector, the street vendors and watch-your-car attendants. These are the women who run their own households, struggling even more to balance domestic care and income-generating work. These are all the people whose resources dwindle when storms surge, floods rise, homes collapse, and streets become impassable. Social and physical hazards aggravate these vulnerabilities. Areas with large and crowded populations, poor infrastructure, weak economic bases are most likely to suffer harm because their exposure level to hazards are high. The vulnerable groups of the city were already living on the margins before the hazards came. They become even more marginal when disasters strike. Those who are small become smaller as disasters deepen social inequalities. Inequalities get worse during the rainy season when typhoons converge with the COVID-19 pandemic. Food becomes more unavailable, economic resources shrink even more, and disease threatens more lives. Action is urgent. What can we do? There's the short-range option and the long-range option. The short-range option is post-disaster relief, when we bring goods like food, clothes, medicine, and temporary shelter to affected people and communities. While necessary and helpful, post-disaster relief does not have a lasting impact. Why? Because the needs of vulnerable people and communities before, during, and after disasters are many and more complex than what relief goods can offer. A long-range and more lasting option is to build resilience in communities. What is resilience? Resilience is the ability to bounce back from an original state. Not simply bounce back, but bounce better forward. Or more collectively, to bounce forward together. That is, to bounce forward together from the acute shocks and chronic stresses that these hazards bring. How do we build resilience? The National Resilience Council set out a perspective for recovery summed up in 3 words: prepare, adapt, transform. 1. Prepare for disaster events. 2. Adapt strategies to strengthen community protection against disasters. And 3. transform communities so they can recover from the loss. No one group can plan, adapt, and transform alone. Building resilience must be a collaborative act that demands the joint action of different stakeholders. Who are these stakeholders? 1. National government agencies that commit resources and make policy. 2. Local government units that execute programs at the local level. 3. Community leaders who enlist the support of residents. 4. Non-governmental organizations or NGOs that provide support services. And 5. Social, natural, and physical scientists who analyze data and design innovations. Building resilience is also a task for citizens like us. What can we do? 1. We can reduce our carbon footprint by adopting an ecologically sustainable lifestyle. For example, we can encourage the adoption of one-use plastics, slow food, slow fashion, and fuel-free mobility within the city. 2. We can support environmental projects in communities like tree planting and backyard garden projects to lower pollution and promote healthy foods. And 3, we can help local government units implement projects to build resiliency through community education, art making, and health and nutrition programs. And while doing these, let us be mindful of the spiritual side of resiliency as we pray with the words that Pope Francis wrote alongside his encyclical Laudato Si. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace.